Welcome to Swing State. I'm your host, Fox 8 senior political reporter Bob Buckley. And tonight, we have a bit of a treat. Some of you will recognize his face. Many of you will know his name. John Hood is here. And you have so many jobs, I'm not quite sure how to introduce you. You worked for a long time, if you know the John Locke Foundation. You worked there for a number of years.
I did.
You have a syndicated column, newspaper column, or print column, I should say. What else? What would be the best title, though?
Well, I'm president of the Pope Foundation, which is a grant-making foundation, and I teach at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy.
Essentially about government, stuff like that, right?
That's right, yes. And then I write books occasionally, and I write columns twice a week. I've been writing my columns since 1986.
Wow.
So I'm not sure what I would do if I ever stopped writing I just have to write things and have my wife read them and yell at me or something.
And we're going to get into that a little later. My famous Uncle Bill, as we call him, William F. Buckley Jr., someone asked him once how he came up with 2 columns a week, and he said, well, the world tends to annoy me twice a week.
That's pretty much it.
Is that about right? But
yeah.
I mean, you've appeared in National Review, his magazine as well.
Yes, in fact, when I started a student magazine at UNC Chapel Hill back in the 80s, I corresponded with him. I hadn't met him yet, but I had corresponded with Bill Buckley, and he gave me some advice, and they little mention in National Review about the creation of the magazine. And some years later, he was no longer the editor, of course, at that time, but some years later when I was doing some work in Washington, I'd worked for a competing magazine, The New Republic, and the editor at the time at National Review had heard that there might be this Southern governor who's going to run for president. So he called me and said, hey, you should do this profile for us. And I said, you understand that North Carolina and Arkansas are really far apart? But he was a Brit, and he just knew it was somewhere in the South.
That's a great little story. So, all right, so from that, you probably know, John, you'd call yourself a conservative.
Sure.
How did you get into politics? I mean, you went to UNC, but what was it? Was it just the family life growing up?
Yes, I started reading the editorial page of the Charlotte Observer, reading William F. Buckley's column in the Charlotte Observer and others when I was 10 years old. I used to read the first presidential race I followed closely was 1976.
Wow, okay.
I was 10 years old. I was reading National Review. I was reading Human Events.
As most 10-year-olds were?
Of course, who wouldn't? I was fascinated with Phil Crane, a name that no one really talks about again, but he was running for president in 76. You know, long story short, he did not become the president.
No, he didn't.
He was a congressman. So anyway, I've been interested in politics, and I'm one of those weirdos who, when I was in high school, I decided, you know what I want to do? I want to write a newspaper column, do television and radio shows, and edit a magazine. And then I went off and wrote a newspaper column and did TV and radio shows and edited a magazine.
I need to say, though, any of you who know John know that he's not an immigrant. Your family has been here, I think, since before there was a country almost.
That's true. My family arrived in the Charlotte area around 1745 or so.
I thought it was even earlier.
No, it's certainly in Virginia in the 1600s, but the first time in North Carolina mid 18th century.
That's what I mean, 1600s, at least in Virginia.
Yes.
You have some famous ancestors you've noted. Now, sometimes there are about 8 greats in front of the name, but who should we know among your ancestors?
Well, there's a lot of relatives that are familiar. North Carolinians will probably know Isaac Shelby, the namesake of Shelby, is a relative of mine. A lot of governors of North Carolina, early governors of North Carolina, were distant cousins or close cousins of mine. The Alexander family in Charlotte that ended up doing the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence and other activities. I'm related to a variety of famous and infamous people, including General John Hood, who's a cousin of mine.
Charlemagne? Probably, right? Aren't we all descended from Charlemagne?
Probably.
That's what I hear.
You could tell by my acquisitive nature.
Yeah, let's get into some of the politics, because that's what you're here for. We have gone through some serious political divides before. I'm thinking 1861 to 65, particularly unpleasant one, as Mary Chestnut liked to say. When you look at the country today, what is the basis of our political divide?
Well, I think we are closely divided, and we are at least sometimes deeply divided. But I think those are two different things. We're closely divided in the sense that if you look at the coalitions, the Democratic and Republican coalitions in America, and even in North Carolina, they're very closely numerically similar.
Right.
There's only small differences between them. Now, there are still people who are in either coalition, swing voters. There used to be a lot of them. Back in the 19th century, we would have very dominant parties, like my cousin Andrew Jackson, who was president of the United States. During his period, there really wasn't much of an effective opposition. The Whig Party didn't really come into its own until later. So we've had periods where you had a Democratic Party that was dominant or a Republican Party that was dominant. We don't have that today. Actually, politics is always going to be more acrimonious when either party can win, when it's really, really competitive. When it's not as competitive, the majority party can be more magnanimous and the minority party is glad just to be a little bit involved. So I think part of it is just that we're closely divided.
But I go back to this thing that some of our friends and mutual colleagues get to. Primaries are killing this country.
Yes.
Parties are now weak. They no longer choose their candidates. The extreme ends of each party choose their candidates, and they choose them on purity, not on who can represent me, but win and get some of the other side. I mean,
I agree with that. I think the primary system has proven to be problematic, and it does mean that a relatively small number of people in those primaries can determine who the nominees are. That's why you end up with so many nominees that non-political junkies say, what?
Yeah.
That's who you picked?
Yeah.
One might cite, for example, the 2024 presidential election as a case where a significant number of Americans say, really? These are our choices?
But that being, and I'm going to get into that next, but you also are on the record saying that disagreement isn't a bad thing.
Of course. In fact, the democratic process is for disagreement. If we didn't have strong differences of opinion, we wouldn't need representative government. We wouldn't have the Congress the way it's designed, where you have to have more than just a simple majority to accomplish something. It's designed to push and pull and get people with different views to compromise and figure out packages they can all maybe not be enthusiastic about, but they can all live with. Some of that process is broken down too, partly because of the weakness of the parties, partly I think because of a unfortunate bipartisan desire of people in Washington who are legislators, and to some extent even in state capitals, to just stop being legislators and just be pundits.
Ben Sasse talks about that all the time. We have only about 30 seconds in this segment, so I don't know if we can complete this, but how do we get to the point where we have two uniquely unlikable candidates according to the public?
Well, I think that's...
I'm talking about the president here, President Biden and former President
I think
Trump.
it's a sort of a comedy of errors. I think that this is ultimately an ego problem for both candidates. Either could have stepped aside, and maybe that would have led the other to step aside. Neither did. It's sort of like a game of chicken. Unfortunately, the head-on collision is for all of us. It isn't just for the two people playing.
Absolutely. All right, well, now that we've talked about who is running, we need to know who John thinks is going to win. We'll talk about the presidential and state races next. We're talking tonight with political commentator and author John Hood about a variety of things, but mostly politics, to which, everyone wants to know who's going to win this presidential election. And I know you know right now.
Well, of course I do. But if I told you everything that I know that's going to happen, that would ruin the surprise.
Right. So in general, though, how does it look right now? If I had to bet today, and again, I'm not endorsing anything, but it looks like President Trump has a bit of an edge going in, because the things people truly care about every day, it really comes down to how do they feel about their life.
Yes.
They don't, democracy, that's an ethereal concept.
It's an abstract. There's even the foreign policy matters, which I care a lot about. Most voters don't rate that very highly. It's not as if they don't care about it at all or have opinions about it, but inflation, which is how they see the economic question, it's not about job. We don't have a job problem.
Right.
We have a price problem.
Well, we do have a worker participation problem.
We do, but that's different. People who want to find jobs in the current economy find it. So jobs per se isn't quite the issue. It's really, are my wages keeping up with prices? And then immigration, which people assume to be an issue about whether immigration is good or bad. For a lot of these voters in the middle, a lot of these swing voters, it's more the illegality, the chaos, rather than simply being for or against immigration. Those are the issues that are helping Trump. And I'll be a contrarian. Since you said what you said, I still think there's a pretty good possibility that Biden will be reelected. And the reason I look at that, partly when I look at the polls that people point out that Trump's the lead, he's in the lead, but he's in the low to mid 40s. There's a lot of people who haven't decided yet, and there's a lot of people who are still parking their vote with Robert F. Kennedy. Our experience with third parties in almost every case, even the Perot case in 92, where there was a large number at the end, but it was a way larger number during the campaign, ended up 19% of the vote or so, but he was in the 30s at various points in the campaign. I think that the Kennedy number will drop as we get closer to the election.
Absolutely.
And I happen to think that a disproportionate number of those voters are actually anti-Trump voters, and they're parking their vote. They don't like Biden. They're disappointed with Biden. They're disappointed with inflation. They're disappointed with other things. Disappointed with other trends in the society. And if Trump runs a disciplined campaign, I think he can get some of those voters. But that's a big if.
The thing that I think Bill Maher, a man of the left, he admits he's very much, he's though railing against his own party, so talking about how the perception is too many in the Democratic Party are coming off as we don't care about, and Tucker Carlson talks about this too from the right, we don't care about the Americans, we care about the people who are coming in who aren't Americans, and they're paying more attention to them than they are to the people who they're elected to represent.
Yes, this is what I'm saying. Yeah. People think that the reason immigration is one of the top voting issues this year is because people are all anti-immigrant. Yeah. There are people who like that, of course. There's a significant
pretty small group.
But that's not the main story. The main story is the sense of chaos and illegality, and don't you care about the rule of law? Mm-hmm. That's why I'm puzzled that President Biden has made the decisions that he made on immigration. He actually could have kept some of Trump's policies and probably reduced his vulnerability on that issue. He has obviously plenty of ammunition against Trump. Trump is a very problematic candidate.
Yes.
That's why one of the most unpopular presidents running for re-election ever in America, whose name is Joe Biden, still has a chance. And that's because he's against a candidate who has lots of negatives of his own.
Did someone mention problematic candidates? I think I heard that. The Republican Party here has nominated a man with a lot to go after. Mark Robinson, if you aren't paying enough attention to know who that is, Mark Robinson from Greensboro, has made a lot of statements that make people feel uncomfortable.
He has.
What do you make of Mark Robinson's candidacy and what it will do either for or against the Republican Party?
The way I read the evidence right now, Bob, is that Robinson is running 4 or 5 points behind Trump and a little bit behind the sort of generic Republican running for statewide office. There's nothing new about that. Roy Cooper won twice, even during times when the Republicans were winning most of the other statewide races. Josh Stein, the Democratic nominee, is not Roy Cooper. He's a rather different candidate from an urban area rather than a rural area, different profile, but he still has the same possibility of winning despite a general Republican trend in North Carolina. Republicans in North Carolina this is not exactly right now a 50-50 state. It's a little bit Republican.
Right.
It's a little bit,
I would say a little bit conservative. It's center right.
It is,
more
but
than Republican.
Now it's actually a little bit Republican in voting behavior. Like on average, for a generic Democrat, generic Republican running for statewide office, the Republican is going to win 52% of the vote.
Well, let me go
but
ahead
I don't know that Robinson can.
Are you a registered Republican?
I'm an independent. I'm one of those old-fashioned. When I went into journalism in the late 80s, early 90s, I was unaffiliated then because I thought that was appropriate.
Right. But character matters in these cases. And does Mark Robinson have a character that disqualifies him from this kind of office?
I think the challenge he has, a lot of those statements that he made on social media, some of them have in fact been taken out of context by Democrats. I went back and looked at that. That's true. Some of them weren't. And I think that the bigger challenge actually Robinson has is, does he look and sound and feel like a governor? If he was running for Congress or U.S. Senate or something like that, may be different. Governors, at least in North Carolina, people do tend to vote for those they see as more of a manager, more of an administrator,
He's a CEO
more
of
of
the
an
state.
executive.
Yeah.
And I think that's Robinson's challenge is even some of the previous lieutenant governors who run for governor, most of them haven't succeeded, but Jim Hunt, for example, did back in, of course, 1976. Lieutenant governors can make something of that office if they really take seriously the very limited powers that they have and go to meetings. Dan Forrest, the Republican who lost to Roy Cooper last time, did in fact build himself up as a credible candidate by doing things. Robinson really hasn't done very much as lieutenant governor. That's part of the challenge he has. Of course, the advantage he has is that this has become a slightly right-leaning state. And generally speaking, North Carolina voters appear to be comfortable with Republican governance in Raleigh. The legislature, even if the districts were drawn fairly, they would probably win both chambers of the General Assembly just because there's a general Republican advantage there.
Where is the line between limited government and maximizing assets within the state control legitimately? So, for example, there is a lot of, we keep putting money in the rainy day fund, we cut taxes and all that. You can make great arguments for that. At the same time, my understanding is we've made real dollar cuts, not just inflation adjusted dollar cuts, to our university system. And we're not exactly rolling in money in K through 12 either when you compare to other states in our region, even adjusting for cost of living. Should the state be spending more money on education since it appears to be there?
Well, I do think that we should do more on the teacher pay front for K-12, and I have a lot of people I've worked with or helped to support, who have various ideas on how to do that effectively. And I don't think it's just across the board raises. We need to do that, but we also need to pay teachers more for taking on different responsibilities. In the university system, you're absolutely right that we've had both tuition has been relatively flat and state and state appropriations certainly haven't gone up. Here's the thing, that North Carolina is still one of the most generous funders of higher education in the United States. We started out so high that even the last 12 years hasn't really changed that. So if you compare us to most of our neighbors or most of our peer states, we still subsidize universities and community colleges to a greater extent.
Well, that is true. We prepay in taxes, what I've told our
Correct.
kids, so you go to the in-state schools.
That's it.
All right, still more to come, including John Hood's side hustle, writing historical fiction. That's next. We are back with political commentator and author John Hood. If you haven't read these books, they're really a lot of fun. Before we get into the title and show the book, how did you get started writing fiction?
Well, I had written a number, I guess 7 or so nonfiction books, histories, political biographies, that sort of thing. But I always had this idea of combining my interest in history, particularly North Carolina history, and my love of fantasy and science fiction type speculative writing. So I had this idea. I kept sharing it with my wife, who kept saying, no more books. I'd written enough books. And finally, I got sick one time and was bored and wrote the first chapter of what became my novel, but it was just a story with Daniel Boone on top of a mountain, on top of actually Hanging Rock, looking over at Pilot Mountain and encountering a monster and a fairy. And I wrote the story, gave it to my wife, sent it to my twin brother, and went to bed. And a couple hours later, my wife comes in, she looks at me and she says, where's chapter 2?
Nice.
And so my judge, who I was under a consent order not to write any more books, she modified the order to allow me to write fiction. And so that's actually how I started writing it, as Mrs. Hood said it was okay.
Do you like it as much as regular writing?
It's at least as much research.
Yeah,
I sort of
absolutely.
outfoxed her a little bit because she was trying to keep me from spending all my time studying things. But I write books that are heavily researched. What I enjoy about it is I like writing adventure stories. I like entertaining people, but I am in fact trying to impart a little history along the way. People learn, even when I use fantasy or made up or folklore elements, the idea is to stick in somebody's head. For example, at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, the key for the British was, how do we evacuate our troops? The Americans are trying to take York, to capture the British army before they could evacuate. The real point of the Battle of Yorktown was in the water. It wasn't on land. It was the French blockade keeping the British from evacuating Cornwallis.
Because the wind blew in their direction.
Correct.
If the wind had blown the other way, the British would have gotten there first.
Yes, but let me tell you, in my version of the story, there's a sea monster.
Okay.
But once you see it in your mind's eye, you will at least remember that the key to Yorktown was the water.
Right.
Even though in my case, I hate to break it to my readers in case they didn't know, there actually wasn't a sea monster.
I was going to say,
Yorktown.
can we prove there wasn't?
No, but it's my supposition, at least.
Okay.
Maybe I'm mistaken.
But that is the when we at our day jobs, we're always thinking everything we write, can I prove this in a court of law? As a journalist, you have to do that. But now you get the freedom to write whatever you want there. Again, it is called Mountain Folk. And what I love about it, too, is not just the people like Daniel Boone, who we do know a fair amount about. You learn about them, but you also learn about names you might have heard, but you don't really know who they were or what they did.
That's exactly right. I mean, an example that's actually someone who lived partly in North Carolina was the previously mentioned Isaac Shelby, for whom Shelby is named, my cousin, who was critical at the Battle of Kings Mountain, which is right over the border in South Carolina. It was a critical turning point in the Southern campaign. But another key character is a Cherokee woman named Nanyehi, sometimes known as Nancy Ward. Nanyehi, again, historical character, this part is all historical, played a very important role in the diplomacy. The Cherokees were divided on what to do during the American Revolution. Some wanted to side with the British, some wanted to side with the Americans, many wanted to stay out. She was counseling peace, but her cousin, Dragging Canoe, ended up launching a war against the Americans in alliance with the British. She thought it was a mistake. It was a mistake, but the way I describe it in the book is from her point of view rather than his, showing that different people at different points in American history have played critical roles, and she played an essential role in what happened in Western North Carolina and Tennessee during the late 1700s.
You can certainly just Google the name Mountain Folk to find these and John Hood's name, but also we'll put a link in, once we put this show online, we'll put that in the same post. Let me get back to politics for a second. Are you generally optimistic? Because people say, we find ways to work things out, but that's only when it doesn't happen by magic. Things work out because people do things to make them work out. I worry that the great Edmund Burke talked about the great obligation of every generation isn't to each other, it's to the next generation. That's and right. Teaching them the collective wisdom of time. And I worry that we're not doing that to the degree we should. This is how we get teachers who want to be the students' friends because they wanted to be their kids' friends, not their parent. Oh. And as our kids have heard ad nauseum, you got plenty of friends. You got one shot at parents. We ain't your friends.
That's true enough. Well, I do take seriously your point that we can't just all root for things to turn out well. We've got to do things. Yeah. I'm involved in some projects to improve the political discourse in North Carolina, like the North Carolina Leadership Forum based at Duke. We bring together 36 leaders at a time and talk about issues and really build relationships across the political divide. And similarly, as you know, you've been involved in the North Carolina Institute of Political Leadership, which I'm involved in. The idea there is to train people who want to run for office or serve in administrative roles or work in politics in some way. Again, get to know each other across the political divide. Absolutely advocate your point of view. Right. We're not trying to make everybody have the same views. That's not going to happen. I have some strong opinions, as you may have noticed. But what we really want people to do is be active listeners. Why would somebody come to a different conclusion than you and not be a villain, not be a liar, and not be a moron?
But that familiarity is absolutely, it sounds so simple, but that's essential. When you know someone, it's much more difficult. Your instinct isn't to demonize.
That's right.
But when you don't know them. And so I think that's what we've got to do is find ways to get people in the same room in an a la carte world where we can hibernate with our media and all that stuff.
You can't do it on devices. You can't build the relationships I'm talking about. They're useful. You can have interesting conversations online, but this is a face-to-face process because so much of it is body language. And if you don't see it, if you don't feel it, you got to be in the same room. And once you've had people in the same room, they have a hard time thinking of each other as villains. They could still disagree with each other. That's not what we're trying to fix. That's not a problem. The problem is not disagreement. The problem is mutual animosity. It's disgust. It's an unwillingness to engage.
So generally, though, you're optimistic?
I tend to be optimistic. I'm hopeful. I'm realistic, and that ends up being optimism.
Okay. And we're hopefully going to keep doing that stuff you're doing to bring people together. That is essential. Congratulations, though, on the books Mountain Folk, and look for John, and you can just Google his name, and a lot of his articles will come up as well. And that is it for tonight, but we want to remind you that we're not just a TV show, we're a dessert topping. Kidding. We're not just a TV show, we are a podcast as well. You can listen to these programs anywhere on our Swing State podcast. Just give a search where you normally get your podcasts.